Hello, everyone. Hi, I'm just going to give everyone a few minutes to get settled, join, hook up to the stream. Welcome. All right, I think we're just going to get started. Hi everyone. My name is Savannah, and I am the Book Week coordinator with SaskBooks, the Creative Industry Association for Book Publishing in Saskatchewan. And I am so excited to have Robert Boschman here today with us, reading from White Coal City, published by the University of Regina Press. This is a wonderful book, and it is such an honor to have him here with us this evening. You are in for a treat getting to hear him read. So thank you all for tuning in. Before we get started, I just wanted to say a few things. First, SaskBooks, our head office, is located on Treaty 4 territory in Regina, but as a provincial industry association for book publishers, SaskBooks' work reaches lands covered by Treaties 2, 4, 5, 6, 8, 10, the traditional lands of the Nahiwak, Anishinaabe, Dakota, Lakota, Nakota, and Dene people, as well as the homeland of the Métis. I'd like to invite everyone to write in the comments the traditional land that you're viewing from. If you don't know, I have a little link here for you to find out. It would be great to see where you're joining from, and that's a really helpful website to find out whose land you're on. And the other thing too is that acknowledgement is just one part of a larger commitment. And we'd like to encourage everyone to read the TRC's calls to action. If you haven't already done that, we have a helpful link as well. I'm also going to post in the chat. If you haven't taken a look at that, take a look and see what you can do and how you can implement those into your life. The other thing is I need to thank our funders. Book Week would not be possible without the Department of Canadian Heritage, the Canada Book Fund, and Creative Saskatchewan. We are so grateful for the support to be able to feature local authors who are focusing on Saskatchewan, and who are and our local publishers. Just this kind of network. We are so grateful for the ability to feature and highlight the work that's happening in the province. Yes, thank you so much to our funders. I'm so honored to introduce Robert Boschman for you this evening. Robert Boschman specializes in eco-critical approaches to American literature with emphasis on the 17th and 20th centuries. His monograph, In the Way of Nature, was published by McFarland in 2009. Found in Alberta, Environmental Themes for the Anthropocene, co-edited with Mario Trono, was published in 2014 by Wilfrid Laurier University Press. Dr. Boschman is founder and co-convener of the award-winning Under Western Skies Biennial Conference Series on the Environment, held at Mount Royal since 2010. He is also a past president of the Association for Literature, Environment, and Culture in Canada. So please join me in welcoming Robert Boschman. Hello.
Hello, and thank you for having me. Can you hear me all right?
I can hear you.
Good. I want to begin by acknowledging the traditional lands where I am tonight here in what we now call Calgary. The lands of Treaty 7, a treaty made in 1877. Lands where I and my family live. These are the ancestral and traditional territories of the Kainai, Piikani, and Siksika, as well as the Tsuut'ina, Nakota, and Métis Nation in Calgary. I also want to begin this evening by reading the dedication of my book, White Coal City, a Memoir of Place and Family, which reads as follows: for the First Nations peoples of Treaties 6, 7, and 10, and the Métis in Saskatchewan, who continue to teach me how to read my own past. Before I get into reading from parts of the book, I also want to thank SaskBooks for the important work that this represents. And I also want to give a shout out to the University of Regina Press and all the good folks there who have made this moment possible, and especially want to express appreciation to the work and collegiality of acquisitions editor Karen Clark. So with that, I'll talk a little bit about this book and its history and inception. I started drafting this book in the summer of 2009, although I have to say that parts of it were written before that and parts of it were in my head. I was busy throughout my early adulthood tracking down this story about the death of my grandmother that I found out about when I was 10 years old, that took place on a street in Saskatoon in 1940, long before I was born. And as a kid and a young adult, this story just sort of wouldn't leave me alone. It haunted me, and I thought that one of the things that I would do when I got to be an older person is that I would try to write it down in a way so that my grandmother wouldn't be forgotten, because that's what really, I think, bothered me the most. And so I worked through my adulthood and gathered materials and made notes and scrapbooks. And I had this box that was in our family, and I interviewed people and made little films and did a lot of reading. And finally, in 2009, I was ready to get going, and then wrote for about a decade. And then met up with the University of Regina Press through Karen, and then the book was in development there for a number of years as well. So it's been a long process, and it's not the only book I've ever done in my life, but this is the book in a way of my life, and I feel that my life is interconnected with the lives of so many others, not only in Saskatchewan but throughout Canada and really across North America, because the story that I tell here, I think, is a story that belongs to everybody. Indigenous peoples who were here for tens of thousands of years prior to any quote unquote discovery, and then the waves of settlers who continue to come to live on these lands. And I just think it's so very important to learn as much as I can, and to do the work of truth and reconciliation. And the reconciliation part is something that I work towards, but it can't happen without the truth. So the part of the book I'm reading about here tonight has to do with the core of the story, which is the death of my grandmother. But as I read from portions of this strand in the story, I'm mindful of the fact that this trauma that happened in our family with big impacts is something that happens right across the land, and in many ways, the land that we live on is a traumatized land, and it's been run over by a car, like my grandmother. And in many ways, my book is very much about cars. If you read it carefully, you'll see automobiles popping up throughout this book, from the very beginning through to the descriptions of the car wash that my grandfather owned and operated, to my obsession with cars when I was a little kid, to the car that took my grandmother's life, and so on and so forth. But the automobile is in many ways an instrument of colonization, and it typifies this relationship that we have to the land that is the mother of all of us, and the relationship is not a good one right now. I think it needs some work. So anyhow, I'll begin reading. I'm going to read from a few different places in the book, and I'm going to start with part 2. Saskatchewan is contained by longitudinal lines. These are the 2nd and 4th meridians which meet each other at the poles. The 1st meridian runs just west of Winnipeg and was so named because at its inception, the spaces beyond were considered wild and empty, uncontained. Of course, they were none of these things. Some anthropologists and historians estimate that approximately 90 million human beings lived in the Americas just before 1492. A century later, that rough figure had fallen by 85%, the single largest decline in any human population in history. Disease, predation, betrayal, theft, the so-called Columbian Exchange, as though a transaction occurred once and then it was over. When the Reverend James Nisbet ventured west from Winnipeg in 1866 to establish his mission, perhaps he was unaware that the humans to whom he would deliver his gospel were but a surviving remnant. Debates continue across the years regarding what men like Nisbet really did or didn't know. Some say that men like him are accountable regardless of what they did or didn't know. Some want the names of men like Nisbet removed from the important places with long traditions, places like the Nisbet Forest, which stretches between Prince Albert and Duck Lake and has been subject to logging and garbage dumping. Others oppose changing any names, even though in between these two places, there are ancient histories that have nothing to do with James Nisbet. Still, this forested region bears his name, and through it runs the 3rd meridian, established by the surveyors who measured and quantified all the geographic space they could find. We live our lives on their terms. Nisbet crossed the high prairie with the help of Indigenous navigators. He may not have made it otherwise. They crossed the South Saskatchewan, north of where Aberdeen would be founded 4 decades later. They crossed on crude rafts, flotation devices really, constructed quickly on the riverside. People, animals, equipment, all were carried downstream before the opposite bank could be reached. And then the march northwards till Nisbet saw the place looking out over the North Saskatchewan, the place he gave a name even though it already had one. If he knew it, he ignored it. Naming a place for empire, that was his appointment. He had entered the triangle of land converging over on the forks where the south meets the north, a point where other humans before him had met at regular intervals for centuries. The water ran clean then. No pipeline ruptures, fertilizers, pulp mill effluents, human sewage, cattle and pig shit, and it teemed with sauger, pickerel, pike, goldeye, and giant ancient sturgeon. It was forded by bear, wolves, and elk. The bison were pretty much gone by then. So it was named Prince Albert, or simply PA. And soon enough, the town fathers laid down roads in all directions. And soon enough, those roads were filled with motor cars. When my paternal grandparents' full story first came to my attention, John, my grandfather, John's words, written in a hand I came to know well, pierced my brain. Bookish kid that I was, living at the back of a laundrette, sandwiched geographically between All Saints Residential School and the jail. I felt my dead grandfather's first words like a 9-inch nail through my identity. The drama of his life and death, and especially the existence of a grandmother named Margaret about whom I had heretofore known nothing, changed my life. I was never the same kid after that. I'd carry their story through all my subsequent years, visiting their graves, reading their letters and journals, having dreams about them. My finding out about Margaret was the result of a question I asked Grandma Edith at Christmas 1970 at her house in Langham, Saskatchewan, 2 years after John's death. I was sitting with my cousins and siblings at her dining room table, and I asked Grandma if she believed in ghosts, and if so, whether she had felt or seen Grandpa in that long house with its ticking clock. I was reluctant to ask such a question for fear of seeming impertinent, but the need to ask overwhelmed me, and so I did. To my relief, she answered me without hesitation. "Yes, I often feel Johnny's presence," she said almost nonchalantly, as though it were an everyday thing. She disappeared into the basement for a few minutes and returned with a dark brown wooden box about the size of a small treasure chest. She placed it on the dining room table, removed the lid, and invited us all to look. That was when I saw the notebook with the boy on the cover, the bright yellow box stuffed with letters, the framed photo of John and Margaret on their wedding day, the yellow and desiccated wedding veil all balled up, the bag of hair, the photograph of Margaret lying in her coffin. There were many other items in this box, but those were the things that caught my attention the first time the box appeared before our family. She was a real person, that lady in the coffin. She looked like my dad. There was her actual hair in a small bundle inside a crumpled brown paper bag. I recognized the little brown bag as a grab bag, the kind that was usually filled with assorted candies and cost a nickel. This one contained dark hair from my father's mother, who I had always assumed was Edith, which was not the case, and I'd have to sort it all out, which would take time. For now, I felt this Margaret enter my life as a real person, speaking to me through that swatch of hair and through a photo of her lifeless in her coffin in a parking lot, clothed in a white dress, surrounded by a crowd looking at her. What a scene. Margaret, perennially young and my grandmother, 21 years before my birth, run over, Edith said, by a traveling salesman from Toronto on his way through Saskatoon. The date would stick in my mind and my heart from then on, as would the name of the driver, Harry D. Reid. Was it the power of kinship through genetic inheritance that I felt in that moment and that changed me? This was an important question that arose later to persist in various forms. In this moment of life-altering discovery, I was entranced by the new knowledge of my paternal grandparents and unborn uncle. John, Margaret, Edith, the boy who wouldn't be. I'd never unsee or undo any of this, but I'd carry a torch for them. Come to understand my grandfather and somehow or other find a way to quote unquote map what had happened. That I knew for sure. Do we have such experiences that shift our being at the cellular level? And if so, do these occurrences ripple and swell beyond and through us, whether or not they're acknowledged or even known? In an age when terms like post-traumatic stress disorder are regularly invoked, some questions may seem naive. But sometimes the things we assume are self-evident or have heard and overheard many times are the things that need recounting. Then and there in Edith's dining room, I was a child with a child's instincts. To me, Margaret's hair had agency. I touched it and it touched me. Molecules intertwined. Atoms uploaded. I stared at the photo of her standing next to John on their wedding day. I stared at the picture of her lying there dead. I saw Willard, my father, as I never had before, and I was altered. The word epigenetic literally means that which is on top of the genes. I think of it as gene skin. It refers to an idea developed before the word itself was coined by a man named Jean-Baptiste Lamarck, who decades before Charles Darwin surmised that, quote unquote, soft inheritance, or the inheritance of acquired traits, plays a role in the relationship between generations. 2 centuries after Lamarck, Susan Merrill Squire describes the exciting promise of epigenetic theory by way of questions now opening up about the generations before us. She asks, for instance, did our grandmothers face starvation during pregnancy, leaving us a legacy of weight problems or undernourishment? For me, the question looks like this. Did my paternal grandfather, John, leave a legacy of extreme trauma that was absorbed by his children, including my father, then a toddler, and subsequently passed on? In particular, I've been wondering about the impacts on the men in my father's family. Arnold, the oldest son, and his sons, especially Digger, my cousin, my me, not me, as well as Marvin and my father. I've also considered the real possibility that I too have been profoundly affected in ways I will never know for sure. Epigenetic theory opens the door to such questions by relaxing the hold of strict genetic determinism. We are only what our genes dictate, and thereby inviting us into, quote, a new understanding of biological organization that stresses plasticity. As philosopher Ada Jarzma puts it, this affects, quote, how we place ourselves in time, especially in relation to ancestral figures. In addition to culture, environment, and genes, the epigenetic dimension of heritability presents itself as an important factor in each individual's development. But more significant still, it also impacts the formation of whole communities and landscapes, with their histories of power, dispossession, betrayal, and violence in particular places and times. In the late 1990s, I tracked down the last living person to see the death of my grandmother. Her name was Elsie Hyde, and she was a teenage girl when she witnessed the accident, standing beside her mother Susie on their front yard at 619 Avenue A North, which is today called Louis Riel Trail, only a few blocks from normal school and the house where John had stayed as a student. Uncle Johnny and Aunt Margaret had just stopped to say hello quickly at Elsie's family home. Elsie was living in a trailer park in British Columbia when I reached her on the phone, and she told me about seeing her Aunt Margaret die, as well as the one thing that really embedded itself in her memory, and that was the sight of a black Oxford shoe, Margaret's shoe, sailing through the air in the same direction as Margaret herself. Most people, fortunately, never experience firsthand the death even of a stranger, let alone that of someone they love. Witnessing a death such as Margaret's does its own peculiar damage, most of which has only recently been acknowledged in the literature on psychic injury. But the true extent of such trauma, inflicted in a split second on the mind and memory, depends on a wide range of individual factors such as physical constitution, genetic disposition, temperament, religious belief, and emotional involvement with the victim. All these were crucial for my grandfather, John. Since childhood, he had suffered from stomach ulcers, which came and went several times a year and frequently flared up during times of stress, of which there had already been plenty in the 1930s. Otherwise physically powerful, he had this one weakness, like the hole in the dike that holds everything. Besides this, he was intelligent, well-read, romantic, but with an emotional life at times so forceful it needed frequent checks and balances. Control was essential. Indeed, he was so good at it, really, that no one except Margaret knew what she called the real Johnny Boschman. Charming, mercurial, flamboyant, volatile. His outlets lay in the journal he kept with her, in the voluminous letters that formed the bedrock of their life together, in their 3 beautiful he-boys, and in his dedication to the land and to horses, dogs, and honeybees. And God played his inextricable role, of course, for it was God who created all things and ordained everything down to the smallest detail. In my grandfather's mind, for the rest of his life, the God who had made Margaret and brought her into his life had also taken her back again. Margaret was not bleeding externally when John reached her. That's the thing. Nor were there any broken bones, nothing at all, except a welt forming on the left side of her face and head. A voice behind John, a man's voice. Knocked out cold. My grandfather turns his head for the second time in less than half a minute. He looks up at the man, but can't see his face because of the sun. She's been knocked out, the man says again. She'll come to. Salts will bring her around. She's dead, says John. The man looks at her and returns to the big car, make and model all a blur to this day. He gets in. He drives away. Canada's criminal code addresses failure to stop at the scene of an accident in 1919. Failure to remain is added 66 years later in the 1985 amendment to the code. The penalty then, as now, is imprisonment for life for failure to stop or remain when the driver knows a death may have occurred. My family has always maintained that alcohol played a role. We will never know for sure. The phrase driving while intoxicated entered the criminal code in 1921. But there is no record of Harry D. Reid being asked to perform a roadside test for intoxication once he was apprehended north of Saskatoon and brought back to the city. The breathalyzer was first used by police in 1952. In Alberta in 1920, in R versus Nickel, a case of drunk driving was judged unlawful and supported a manslaughter conviction. But there was no indication in any of the legal documents or newspapers that Harry Reid was impaired. The Peterses and Boschmans could be fair and forgiving, gentle even. And had Reid ever shown a sign of remorse or horror, said he was sorry, or written to them, I'd have heard. In the late 1990s, those still alive who were connected to John and Margaret and could recall June 29th, 1940, all said the same things. That Reed, a traveling salesman from Toronto, was drinking that day, and that he left the scene and was stopped by the police at 13 Mile Corner. Yet his name wasn't even brought into the inquest. It was left to the press to publish it. Harry D. Reed was exonerated, though his insurance and policy and lawyer in the East kicked into gear to negotiate a settlement with John through his lawyer. Jacob Peters, Margaret's father, was angry and said, if I just had the money, I would make that man pay. But of course, Jacob had no money. At this time, his 15th and youngest child was 5 years old, the same age as Margaret's oldest boy. After the autopsy, the coroner's inquest, and the final preparation of McCaig's funeral home, Margaret was taken to Aberdeen by train. John asked that she be outfitted in her wedding dress, the white one that had raised a few eyebrows at their wedding. And so I continue to see her dressed in white in the photograph that stunned my childhood mind and continues to grip my adult one. Her eyes are closed, her face lovely and young, hair corvid and black against the white satin. Someone in the family, likely her mother or John, took the picture. The casket is open in the parking lot of the Aberdeen Mennonite Church. The lot is crowded with men and women and children, and off in the distance I can see vehicles of that era as well as the Aberdeen grain terminal. The men wear hats of various kinds, and one boy wears a ball cap. The women wear hats with floral arrangements, and one woman looks on at the open casket with hands clasped at her bosom. I can't detect my father or his brothers in this photo, though they are there. My father remembers nothing of this day. Indeed, nothing of Margaret. But according to some who were there, my 2-year-old father walked around matter-of-factly informing people, my mummy is dead. When John phoned the Peters family on the evening of June 29th to tell them that Margaret was dead, he was still at the police station. He had just given a statement along with the other eyewitnesses and the driver of the car of the man from Toronto. Convinced that the woman he had hit was not dead but merely injured, the man had returned to his car and driven away. The police had to retrieve him north of the city and return to the scene with his car. The Reverend Henry Rempel's car, coming from the north, was almost precisely opposite Margaret when the car struck her. As he drove past, Reverend Rempel saw her body projected up and ahead of the Plymouth as well as towards the east. He estimated the driver's speed at 15 to 20 miles per hour. The driver, he said, came to a stop 17 feet past the point of impact. Looking for southbound traffic, Margaret Boschman hadn't seen him coming. Just ahead of Rempel on a return trip from the airport was a light delivery truck with a young man named Gilbert Mooney riding in the back, leaning against the cab. As the truck passed, he saw the 2 pregnant women chatting across the avenue, and thereafter Mooney witnessed the entire accident unfold as he telescopically pulled away and the car that would strike her approached. Like Rempel, Mooney could see that Margaret was in a hurry to cross the avenue and wasn't watching for traffic from the south. She didn't appear to notice the oncoming car's horn either. Mooney's co-worker, David Penner, riding in the cab, also heard the horn. Turning around to look behind him through the rear window, he saw a body flying through the air. Susie Hyde disagreed with this account. She hadn't heard a horn at all and estimated the driver's speed at 35 to 40 miles per hour. She noticed him driving somewhat erratically and for a moment thought he would hit John's Plymouth. Margaret, she maintained, had hardly taken her hand from the Boschman car when the other car struck her, tossing her like a green leaf scudding across the ground. These various and conflicting statements were documented by Constable Gregain, who had tested the car's brakes and found them in good working condition. Hitting the binders at 20 miles per hour, Gregain brought the vehicle to a full stop within 9 feet. Hitting them again at 30 required an additional 7 feet before the big machine ground to a halt. There was no evidence of skid marks. Margaret, meanwhile, was taken by ambulance to the city hospital, a red brick edifice 1 block from the river where Cornelius Epp, John's old friend and fellow teacher, identified her on John's behalf. And in the emergency ward, a young intern, Dr. Alexander Danilchuk, pronounced her dead, and another physician, Dr. W.S. Lindsay, established cause of death as shock and internal hemorrhage of the brain. Lindsay verified that Margaret's death had likely been instant and that she was in her 6th month of pregnancy. By the time her family arrived, Margaret had been transferred down to the morgue in the basement of the hospital. None who saw her that night, neither Jacob nor her mother Helena, with all her experience, nor the 2 boys, Jim and Bill, who had come along with their parents, and like them, descended the stairs, dreading what they'd see. None of these was quite prepared for the sight of Margaret laid out on her back in the coroner's table, her head resting on a split block of wood. 58 years later, Jim recalled most vividly that block of wood. He was dying when he said this, cancer all over. It seemed so cruel, you know, that block of wood for a pillow. When young Bill Peters had taken the phone call from his brother-in-law earlier that evening, he'd been unable to tell Helena, standing by the kitchen table, that Margaret was dead. His face as white as could be, all Bill could say was that she'd been hit by a car in Saskatoon. Now the unbelievable news was so real they could reach out and touch her, down there in the basement of the old city hospital, all red brick and gloom, the South Saskatchewan River flowing silently past only a block away. Among the Boschman and Peters families, no one had ever witnessed one of their dead processed by the system in place in the city. They were used to taking care of their own, putting them to bed, they called it. John was the only member of the 2 families who had actually lived in Saskatoon, and that was during the school term at normal school 8 years before, when all he could think of really was Margaret. When he might see her again, or at least find a letter from her at the foot of the stairs leading up to his rooms over on Avenue B. And that dream of his, Margaret reaching between the bars of her bed to touch his hair. The thing about trauma, even a small one, is that it keeps coming. Like a nasty dog snapping at your ass and hamstrings, it follows. It's a dogged, fangy memory thing, and until you turn to face it, and wise guidance is needed for this, it'll continue to nag, tear at, and hang on you. Sometimes I think not just about my grandfather, but all those around him in that moment when Margaret stepped out and was struck by Harry D. Reid's car. From there, the event ripples across time and through relationships in ways that cannot be documented. It's created havoc in my family right into a new century when those affected have no idea what it is anymore, even though it resides as a legacy right inside their bones and dreams. There are people who study this phenomenon. The field is called transmission studies. One scholar, M. Gerard Frum, edited a book called Lost in Transmission, in which a researcher, Ileani Kogan, describes, quote, themes of joining with the damaged other, healing them or assuaging the guilt for not doing so, as well as the profound confusion between past and present and inner and outer, end quote. These researchers also speak of sequelae, those things that follow, and the damage done to the hippocampus, that part of the brain where memories are stored, and where trauma is either hidden and contained or jangles and intrudes all the day long and every night throughout a lifetime. Once I had a dream about John in which he showed me another journal, additional to the several of his that I keep. Another journal unknown to me. Things contained therein that remain unknown, unconscious. In another dream, beings approach me crying, more, more. And I wake up confused and upset. I return to what can be teased out and known. That is all I can do. I reread the transcript of the court proceedings translated from Pittman shorthand after decades in the darkness of a stairwell at the Saskatoon City Courthouse, followed by another decade in which I search for anyone who can read the stenographer's hand from early July 1940. And what I find there, or finally, is the moment itself in fragments of writing or as close to the moment itself as anything I will ever find. The transcriber writes, "Please be aware that this appears to be a witness statement which I believe has been taken down by someone as another person is conducting an interview. The shorthand writer is therefore writing at a very fast rate, and so these outlines are almost scribbled." End quote. Everything happens so fast. The mind strains to slow the pace of events and see the details and fragments repeated again and again. Lawyers for the Crown and other officers of the court gather for the proceedings on July 2nd, 1940. Their names echo in newspaper accounts. Ross, Campbell, Wrigley, Lambton, Castles, Simon. One puts questions aggressively to the Reverend Henry Rempel, whose vehicle passed directly opposite Margaret as she stepped out to visit with Susie Hyde. "Were you alone in the car?" "My wife was with me." "She was sitting in the front seat?" "Yes, sir." "And how close to the car and the deceased woman were you in feet?" "Maybe 8, yes." "It happened in front of you?" "Yes, sir." "Had you seen the deceased woman before she was struck by the car?" "Yes, sir." "What did you see her do?" "I saw her coming from the car south of me in front of her car and past my car where the accident happened." "Was she near at the time, to your knowledge, in the car, or was she outside on the ground?" "Tell me when you saw her." "I saw her coming from the car south of me in front of the car." "My question was, do you confirm you saw her south in the car?" "No." "And do you confirm seeing her when she was east of you?" "Yes." "And from the east side, the car was driving away?" "Yes." "Towards the front of the car?" "Yes, sir." "And did she continue her motions? Tell me, or did she move south?" "No, she did not." "Was she moving? Tell me. Was she moving? Tell me. Was there much traffic on Avenue B at the time?" "Very much." "North and south?" "Some southbound." Where you were bound?" "Yes, sir." "And did you happen to warn her of your approach? Blow your horn or otherwise?" "No, I did not blow my horn. No, we screamed." From here, pieces of memory and bits of knowledge gather and form swiftly. Released faster than I can keep up with, they coalesce and move together as one thing, like shimmering small birds rising from the ground. Digger, my cousin, in a greenhouse on the edge of Langham, locking a mouse in a jar with a lighted candle. He watches the oxygen slowly leave before heaving the jar from the back door into the -40 night. Willard, my father, for the first time in family history, turning on the electric lights in the family home, wondering why he's the one that John selects to flip the switch. John walking on his hands using Coke bottles, and one breaks and slices his palm. Arnold bringing a horse switch down across my father's face. When I ask the brothers about it, they refuse to speak. "No, we won't talk about that." I, a teen, putting John's 1960s Philips electric razor to my nose, catching a whiff of his scent locked in old stubble, clicking the on switch to shave my 3-haired chin. Edith singing "Twilight Comes Stealing" as night blankets the teacherage, newly attached to the electric grid. This is the last part I'm going to read, and then that'll be it. When I returned to Saskatoon in late June to see my parents, my father and I go to the Tim Hortons coffee shop on the Louis Riel Trail. This particular Tim Hortons stands right where the Hyde Bungalow stood on June 29th, 1940. Crossing the widened boulevard, the two of us are now in the place where Margaret was that day. It's about 6:30 p.m. for us, as it was for her. We stand with her. We look north as we know she did. Traffic from the south whizzing past. I wonder how many times I have driven by this place where Harry D. Reid hit her. Great fires are burning in the north, and a pall of smoke hangs in the air. Willard, my father, at my behest, returns to the Tim Hortons parking lot ahead of me. I want to take a picture of him, now in his 9th decade, cradling his coffee in the drifting smoke while looking back at me. Driving back to his condo, we talk about Tim Horton, a popular NHL player who died in an alcohol-fueled car accident in 1974, 2 years past the peak of vehicular deaths in the 20th century. We also discuss the news of the day, this concerning the farm at Langham, that John purchased as a retirement project, where he planted windbreaks that continue to stand. Where this story begins for me, my initial awareness, my cousin Digger and his scarred throat, John and his bees, and a hand held out to me with raw honey and wax. Apparently, a smelting company wanted to buy up all that land, dig a giant hole in which to bury a giant box to contain their toxic heavy metals. All the residue from all the smelting this company would ever produce into the future would, they promised, reside safely here, forever sealed in the same earth John had farmed. They promised it will never leak, but it will leak. And the communities in the area gather together to consider this fact carefully, and with one voice, they finally say no to this. And so it isn't done. After all, no buried box on John's dream farm. No more toxic leaks here. In this same summer, an oil pipeline breaks open beneath the North Saskatchewan River, spilling more than 200,000 liters of heavy oil into the water flowing east. The pipeline belongs to Husky Energy. The rupture has taken place in Alberta, upstream from Prince Albert, and the city's engineers move swiftly to shut down the water intake before the oil can contaminate their water treatment facility and infrastructure. All of PA is forced to go without running water from the river for 2 months. In the meantime, city engineers rapidly build out a water pipeline to a temporary source miles away. Hardest hit are the First Nations communities located along the river, especially the James Smith Reserve. They have no alternative. They watch the oily waters flow past to meet the South Saskatchewan at the Forks. Husky Energy brings in a scientist to speak to the media. The scientist who worked on the Exxon Valdez spill is quoted in all the papers saying, "Oil basically breaks down naturally. It's just the question of what is an acceptable time frame." End quote. Numerous charges are laid against Husky Energy, which also faces lawsuits filed by the city of Prince Albert as well as by local First Nations communities like James Smith. But 93 of the company's documents related to the spill are sealed when a judge rules on behalf of Husky because of what he calls litigation privilege. The documents account for Husky's own investigation of the pipeline rupture. These cannot be seen by the people of Saskatchewan. A pipeline might leak, but the files that tell its story are sealed. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Robert, for that amazing reading. Thank you. What an honor to hear you speak. I would love to open it up to questions if people have questions. I'm sure you do. I saw a comment that someone is in a book club that did focus on White Coal City. So if you have questions, please put them in the chat and I'll post them up. A few seconds to respond. In the meantime, just while people are posing them, I do have a question for you.
Sure.
What does it mean to you to be from a place, like to carry the trauma of a place, to be from PA, but also what kind of responsibility does that carry to be from there as well, if that makes sense?
Well, I can only answer that as a white settler.
Yes.
Who is a white settler child in that place. And one of the things that I really tried hard to do in this book is to give a large focus to pre-adolescent childhood, my pre-adolescent childhood. So there's no teen stuff here. Because I wanted to examine, what's it like, as far as I could remember, what's it like to come to emerge into consciousness and to realize that you're born into something. We're all born into something. But I wanted to explore what exactly I was born into. And so the natural, this had been a question for me since that box that I read about here tonight. A big question for me. But as I explored that in my own personal familial circle, a larger circle appeared, and that's the circle of the larger community. And that community is Prince Albert, PA, which has another name, and was a place before colonization, before it was named after the consort of Queen Victoria. And so I really wanted to dig into that from my perspective, not telling anyone else's story but my own. And then the circle got larger because those meridians are there and they circle the planet. And so we're connected. We're connected all the way around. And the story of colonization then becomes one that has spread like a juggernaut, not only on this continent, but on other continents as well, with tremendous impacts on land and water and air and the indigenous peoples who lived in those places, who have lived in those places since time immemorial and since before anything could be written down. And so that is, I guess I see myself as coming from a very specific place, but a place that shares attributes with many, many other places.
Thank you. Thank you for that. I have a question here from Karen Clark. She says, Mario Vargas Llosa, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that correct, says his writing didn't change anything for him, that art might save others, but not him. Have you felt a sense of closure or healing from the family trauma since completing the book and living with it now for a while?
No, actually, I think things kind of have become worse for me, because that's the way it is when you open something up. And I continue to have very powerful dreams, and things continue to happen in my life that are connected to me. And I continue to follow those and try to explore them with as much conscious power as I can. But I know what I do know, and what I am comforted by, is that the past is with me, and that I have children, particularly a young son who's 11, and the future is his. The future is still mine too, but the future is his. And I see in him a generation of promise, of a new thing in this place called Canada. And I'm hoping, and I don't think it's whimsical hope on my part. I think that there's a strong sense of healing that's going across this land. But anytime you heal from a wound, there's pain involved. You know, healing can kill you. That's the way healing is. And so I'm part of that healing, and I'll do the best that I can, but I don't, to answer the question, the great question. Thanks, Karen. I don't feel any, I have to agree with that. Yeah, I think stories of truth of the colonial legacy are the only way to go. We have to do this. We have to do this. You know, it's not only, it's about truth and reconciliation and the work of that 2015 document. It's the work of acknowledging the children who have been uncovered in the past few months, and there will be more. But it's also the work of the damages done to our beloved planet in the name of colonial legacies and colonial agendas. And we have to come to grips with that legacy, or we are in big trouble, all of us. And so there's no choice in the matter. I think that this is the most important work of this century. You know, I talk to students about the big bad event of the 20th century, and I take them, when I do, I always take them to the First War, the Great War. And from there, you can move forward through the Great War to arguably an extension of the Great War, the Second War, and then through that to all of the events of the 20th century. And there are so many and so calamitous. But in looking at this century, which begins with 9/11, I really think that truth and reconciliation, the two go hand in hand. You can't have one without the other. and it's a painful process, and it also happens to involve saving our own skins, because we're not going to make it unless we do this work.
I think that kind of answers, in some ways, the question posed by Crystal Boschman. Do you think there's any connection to the TRC and your book? If so, how? I don't know if you want to expand on that at all, but you kind of did touch on it. That is another question that was posed.
Yeah, that's a question that really connects to the second core part of this book I read from earlier today at another reading, and that is my family's participation in the scoop when I was 10 years old. So that's another very important thing that I had to tell from my perspective, not the story of my sister Crystal, but my story of witnessing that event when I was 10, and of her coming into my life, and that's a very, very powerful story, and one that is shared with people right across this land, and we're coming to terms with that as well now. So yeah, the TRC is a document that I quote in my book, and I quote it seriously because it's a serious document.
Thank you. Amanda Nichols has a question. Says, thank you, Rob, for sharing your story. I'm curious about what role, if any, grief played in your decision to write this book. Grief for your family, grief about colonization, or for the planet?
That's a great question. I'm on medication. I was born into grief. And as a child, I was very melancholy. I had fun. I played a lot. I was a kid's kid, but I had a melancholy streak that ran through me, and I knew it was there, and it had a grip on me. And I struggled into my early adulthood with that deep sadness, and I never quite knew where it came from. Although obviously, I think I do know where it came from, and that's what I'm exploring in this book. But I want to say that for over 20 years now, I've been in treatment, and I take that treatment seriously, and will be for the rest of my life. And I live a full life right now because of that treatment, and it's not something I'm ashamed of in the least. It needs to be that needs to be discussed as well, more openly amongst us, and just acknowledged as part of life.
Thank you so much, Rob. There's another question here. Are we in a turning in the national narrative of Canada?
I really hope so. I'm more hopeful now than I've ever been, but there are serious violent forces that are reared up and pushing back, and we're all seeing that, and we know it. And those are forces of fear and ignorance. And unfortunately, when fear and ignorance work their way through the human organism, often the result is tragedy and destruction. And so, this is part of the healing. Like I said before, there's more pain to come, and I consider it the work of the rest of my life to do all I can to work towards a new national narrative in Canada that is built on the reality of the land we live on, that goes back far farther than 500 years.
Thank you. Does anyone else have any questions they want to pose? I think we maybe could do one more. I don't see any others in the comments, but if you have one, now is your chance. I'll give people a second. One thing I'm also curious about is how if the writing of this book, you worked on it for so many years, how it has shaped the way that you think of your other projects. Like here, I'm thinking about your work on Uranium City, and how doing such a deep exploration of place in your memoir and that family history, how that has kind of impacted that other work.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I'm very excited about the work that I'm doing, which is another long project, and I'm not doing it alone. I'm working with a team consisting of my colleague Bill Bunn at Mount Royal and a PhD student at the University of Toronto and a Shirk Fellow named Sarah Elizabeth Howden. And we've been up to Uranium City twice. We've been down to a place in Wyoming called Jeffrey City. These are uranium extraction legacy communities that are largely abandoned after being one commodity extraction human communities for a time. And actually, this Friday we're off to the starting point of the story of uranium in the Czech Republic, and then from there we'll be going to some other communities in the global South that have also been uranium communities that were then subsequently abandoned by the corporations and governments that created them in the first place. So, I do see an ongoingness to my work, and the connection between these places and Prince Albert is a very strong one. Prince Albert is a place that just has not been abandoned, but it's still there, and it has many similar legacies. Although I would say the main legacy of Prince Albert is that it is a place of incarceration.
Yes.
It's where you go to jail.
Thank you. Thank you for that. Well, I really appreciate you taking the time to speak with us tonight. I don't see any other questions. There's a comment though. Great book. I knew this family history, but not the extent you've written. It opened a lot of conversations amongst my second cousins and myself. So thank you for that.
You're welcome.
Actually, maybe there's one last question. When our book club discussed the book last week, we considered the depictions of masculinities in your memoir and got bogged down on the culture of hockey.
Yeah.
Comment? Off topic, I know.
Yeah, hockey is another big part of this story, and I played hockey, and I'm sure that I will likely run into trouble with some people around the discussion of hockey. But hockey is a core part of the life of Prince Albert and part of the myth of Canada, of course. So how could I not go there? And I did. And yeah, you're right. It's very bound up with masculinity and in ways that are scarring for many people. So thanks for that.
Thank you, Valerie. Yeah, well, I think we'll leave it at that. Thank you so much for joining us this evening and for reading your moving and really important book.
You're welcome.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
It's my pleasure and honor to be here.
Thank you, Robert. I'm going to paste a link here. Please go buy this book from the University of Regina Press. If not from the press, from a local independent bookstore, from the publishers, from U of R Press, or from local independent bookstores. Yeah, it's a really great book, and I really encourage you all to read it if you haven't. Thank you for your time. Thank you everyone for tuning in tonight. Thank you for your wonderful questions. And yeah, I just really appreciate this evening. So thank you. Have a lovely rest of your night, everyone.
Thank you so much. Good night, everybody.